welcome to the Theology Pugcast. Great to have you here for this episode. We've got a special guest and a subject that's going to be a lot of fun to talk about. But before we jump into any of that and have her introduce herself, we'll just do what we normally do, and that's introduce ourselves. I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I've taught philosophy at the college level, and I'm a senior editor at Touchstone Magazine, and I've written a number of books. Okay, enough about me. Let's kick it over to you, Tom.
I'm Tom Price. I teach theology and theological ethics at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary and teach philosophy as well at a university nearby.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we know that at university. Anyway, Glenn.
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm a retired history professor from Central Connecticut State University. I am a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. I have my own ministry as well, Every Square Inch Ministries. That's at esquareinch.org. And I work for Reflections Ministries. I do freelance speaking and a bunch of other stuff.
Okay. So we're pleased to introduce Bethel. She's going to talk a little bit about herself and then kind of take us into the subject of the day, which is a lecture that was delivered by Paul Kingsnorth. Okay, Bethel.
Hi, everyone. I'm Bethel McGrew. I'm a freelance journalist, essayist, occasional poet. I roam around. You might have seen my work in places like First Things or National Review or The Critic, The Spectator. I get around. I used to write under a pen name, but I chose to uncloak a few years ago, and now I have my own. Unmask myself there. So now I have a Substack like everyone else. My Substack is further up, and that's doing pretty well. Oh, I'm a columnist regularly for World Magazine, too. I do a lot for their opinions page. And most recently in print, you'll see me in Davenant's new Life on the Silent Planet collection. I did an essay on Paralandra and the Unmanned, which was a lot of fun to do. And also I have a PhD in mathematics, which has nothing to do with the work I do nowadays. But it is fun to occasionally, wave the doctor around. It's fun to get to do. So yeah, it's a little about me.
Okay, great. So take us into the lecture. So Paul Kingsnorth, folks might be familiar with him because he's been, kind of a new sort of celebrity convert in the Christian world. But can you introduce us to the lecture?
Yeah, I'm sure Paul would hate that phrase, celebrity convert. That would be just like, he would just cringe at that. But yeah, Kingsnorth's a celebrated writer, literary figure, former environmental activist. And he had a very striking conversion testimony in First Things a couple of years ago. And, just this a compelling story of initially resisting Christianity and then being dragged into it, a little bit Lewisian in some ways, except his background was very, very different from Lewis's. And now he inhabits Eastern Orthodox space, which is very different from Lewis's Western brand of Christianity. And so he's continued to write and be provocative and interesting and keep people talking. And so First Things invited him to give the Erasmus lecture this year, which was, in a sense, it made sense because his testimony was published in First Things, but it was also an interesting move because of the nature of the lecture he gave, which was this very, a kind of a radical Christianity. It's our mutual friend Vesper Stamper said, she wasn't expecting to see the hippie give the keynote. That's kind of how it felt. It's very sort of radical cost of discipleship kind of vibe that he was striking, and he called it against Christian civilization. And he said a whole bunch of things, some of which I agreed with, some of which I didn't agree with so much, and a lot that I thought was incomplete and needed to be qualified or fleshed out or enriched in various ways. But it was definitely interesting and will stimulate lots of interesting discourse.
Yeah. Well, when he starts the essay, of course, as someone visiting the United States, and he took us back to a visit a few years back where he was in one of the Dakotas and visiting the site of Little Bighorn in the battle there and all that kind of stuff. And I thought as soon as he did that, I thought, okay, I know what's coming now.
Yeah, I've had that class once or twice.
That's right. Now, what you do when you select historical events, it tells a lot about you. So I thought, well, He could have visited the state park in Kentucky, where my sixth great grandmother is honored, who was the famous pioneer woman Jenny Wiley, who lost all of her children in an Indian raid. They were all killed, including the child that she gave birth to after she was taken captive, and that child was scalped. She escaped after 11 months and then was reunited to her husband and had a second bunch of children. And because of her exploits and because of her heroism, she's honored in eastern Kentucky. And very politically incorrect, the raiding party were Native Americans. They were Indians. There were 6 of them. And they mercilessly killed her children in front of her. So, that's maybe where I would have started. So there's always more to these things, and that's I guess that's my point. And that he segues into the Normans did the same sort of thing to the Anglo-Saxons. And then I thought, well, like 400 years before that, the Anglo-Saxons came in and did the same thing to the Britons.
Right.
so it all depends on where you start and who you're talking about. And now, to give him credit, he does take us, very briefly into kind of a reality check, in that this is the history of the human race. This isn't just European history, and we could have dove into the history of how Native American tribes, waged war against each other for hundreds and hundreds of years. So,
there's a film I'm thinking of. This clip I see go around, but this very honest conversation between an American military man and an Indian chief, where they're discussing exactly this history. Does anyone know the clip I'm thinking of? I'll have to go find it now. But
no, I know it, but I don't know the film. Yeah,
and it's rare in the they're saying some of the quiet parts out loud here, like, we've all got stuff, right?
Right.
Yeah, there was a Canadian film called Black Robe that brought out many of the same kinds of things. But it's the sort of film that would never have been made in the United States. I'm not sure it would be made in Canada today, but it was a really interesting film because it was kind of unvarnished in terms of the way it depicted the Native Americans and their intertribal conflicts, among other things.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that when I thought about Kingsnorth and his approach, it struck me as a kind of noble savage sort of argument that we get all the time from people who are on the left and who have been influenced by Rousseau and sort of this. I know people don't think of the left as kind of natural anymore because of all the transgender and kind of crazy stuff that's going on with
no, but I know what you mean.
Yeah. We're talking about it's the old hippies. Yeah,
exactly, the old hippies. That's why Vesper said it was the hippie giving the keynote. And so maybe we could get into a little bit. So he mentions this figure. Indian name was Ohiyesa, then he became Charles Eastman, and he was this reformer / bridge builder, guy who joined American civilization, put on the suit and tie, and did come to think of himself as American, but he always had retained his Native American soul, and wrote some books about that. And he sort of forms the cornerstone of Kingsnorth's lecture, because at the end of this one book, he concludes that Christianity and civilization are fundamentally opposed. Like, you can't have Christian civilization; it's an oxymoron. But what I feel like Kingsnorth glosses over, if you go, because I actually went and I read The Soul of the Indian, I read Eastman's autobiography, is that there's a degree of syncretism there and line blurring, where he claims to be a Christian, but he also doesn't seem to think that the Indians have to change a whole lot about how they think about religion and God and stuff in order to become Christians. It's like they're practically 3/4 of the way there already. And that's problematic. And I mean, and now I'm kind of jumping ahead because Kingsnorth takes a few swipes at Jordan Peterson later in the lecture. But I think Jordan Peterson would actually like some of Eastman's stuff, but for the wrong reasons,
Yeah, he very definitely said, from his description of Eastman's book, that basically the Native Americans, for all practical purposes, were Christians, that their religion was
Yeah,
Christianity. I mean, and
right.
yeah, actually that they were more Christian than the Christians were in practice.
Yeah,
That
we've heard this before.
yeah,
So
the white men may be teaching us about Christianity, but we've really got it, and they don't. Is sort of the sense of what he was saying.
right.
Yeah, related to that, I wonder too. There's a tendency, with people on, sort of the Christian left and radical Reformation types to elevate ethics and downplay doctrine to a degree that it's almost as though there's nothing of real significance when it comes to sort of the intellectual kind of patrimony we have in the Christian faith. It's all kind of comes down to behavior, and if things resemble a particular, and again, this is where he was cherry picking historically, but he was also cherry picking scripture. So as he's quoting scripture, and thinking, okay, this is what I expect: strong Sermon on the Mount stuff, an appeal to James' epistle, and that kind of thing. Nothing coming from like the Decalogue, nothing coming from like Proverbs, nothing related to like the fact that we're encouraged to pass on an inheritance to our children and our grandchildren, things like that. Nothing related to like property rights that are implied in like the command not to steal, or even covet. None of that stuff is brought
Right.
up.
Yeah. The other thing that I was thinking about, I did like the part where he was listing the 7 deadly sins, and he did have a dig at Pride Month in there.
Yes.
And I mean that kind of opens up an interesting tension that I'm not sure Kingsnorth really perceives, because the word culture war comes up a lot, disparagingly. Culture war bad. We don't want to be too culture war-y here, but it's riffing on the Lord of the Rings. Culture war is upon us, whether we sought it out or not. And I think in various respects, Kingsnorth himself, like even just in that dig at Pride Month, it's like, ooh, Paul, isn't that a little culture war-y? I mean, but people would consider that, already you're engaged, you're doing culture war, whether you realize it or not. And so I think we need to tease different
Yeah.
meanings of this phrase apart from each other.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that teasing out is very important here, and I run into it all the time. I deal with, for example, I recently gave a talk on natural law, and I spent the first part of the talk talking about the way in which most modern variants of it are distortions of an Enlightenment alterations of the classic Christian vision, and yet all the discussion centers around attacking those modern kind of pathologies rather than the genuine article, and spent the rest of the time basically debating that point with everyone in there. And I think similarly, I think what you have here is first you have a certain kind of there is sort of Protestant liberalism. And there was a strange kind of carryover, the relationship to culture and Christianity and its progressive understanding. That is one thing that still sits around and is a fair target of critique at the way in which I think a pathological understanding of Christianity wedded itself to cultures of progress. And then you also have the kind of Enlightenment distortions and emphasis on ethics over doctrine. And you still have, I think, lingering kind of Protestant liberal interpretations of what's going on. For example, the old von Harnack thesis that Christianity basically got wedded to Greek culture and spread a deformed kind of Christianity on the world that wasn't, the classic Christian vision wasn't this kind of pure Christianity, which was really just ethics. And so you have all this stuff floating around out there. And I think then last point here is that there is a genuine aspect to what I think Kingsnorth is onto, where it is that we don't want to functionalize the Christian faith where it becomes an idol. And that's a fair point. And I think there's a temptation during times of challenge to do that. How can Christianity buttress my ideal social type? But on the flip side, to say, seek ye first the kingdom of God and the wealth of his righteousness, and that when it comes down to making a decision, your decision for heavenly things over earthly things is such that it's not going to be salt and light in the world. And that the salt and light part is insignificant. I think that's where Kingsnorth misses the accent. There is a place for being salt and light, for limiting the spread of evil, and to orienting things into submission to Christ.
Yeah, there are two things that came up. I listened to the lecture and the Q&A afterwards. And there were two things that I thought were significant, valuable that he said. One of them is that there is a push by a number of people, some Christians, some not, who are suggesting that what we need to do is to recover Christianity as a way of saving Western civilization. And that's a problem, because what that does is it absolutizes Western civilization and it turns it into an idol, and it makes Christianity a means to an end. And when he talks about against Christian civilization, that's primarily, I think, what he has in mind. That's what he was thinking of first. The other thing is, somebody brought up, for example, the development of hospitals and charitable institutions in the Q&A. He said, what do you do with that? And he said, well, you need to make a distinction between culture and civilization. For Kingsnorth, civilization has a very distinctive definition that has to do with power structures and things of that sort. So he thinks that it's perfectly appropriate to create Christian cultural artifacts like hospitals and things of that sort, so that you can live out your faith in that way. But to embed Christianity into a power structure to govern society, to run society, things like that, it seems to me that's where he sees the problem lying, really. If I'm understanding him right, he's a little slippery.
He is, and I don't.
There.
Right, I agree with you. He does seem to be working with his own sort of bespoke definition of civilization, because I don't know that culture and civilization could be so easily teased apart. I found a little quote that I want to quickly read, because so Marxism is this interesting kind of running thread, and it's interesting because once again, I think there's tensions within Kingsnorth's own thinking, because on the one hand, like I've heard him, recognizing the evils of wokeness and whatnot, and the evils of the communist regime, and how they crushed people and persecuted the saints and all of that. But he also seems to have some Marxist tendencies. And there's this very interesting sermon that I found from one of the great martyrs of communism in Poland, Father Jerzy Pawluszko. I learned his story first reading Rod Dreher's Live Not by Lies. And there's a sermon he gave where he talks about Polish culture and the beauty of the Polish Christian culture and civilization that was destroyed by the communists. So I'll read this bit here. Polish culture from the start carries within itself a clear Christian character. Christianity has always been reflected in the history of our thought, art, poetry, music, drama, ceramics, painting, and sculpture. Polish culture for centuries was inspired by the gospel. Adam Mickiewicz, our national poet, wrote that a civilization to be truly worthy of man must be Christian. Thanks to Christianity, we are connected with Western culture, and that is why we could resist all the barbaric cultures. We could resist cultures superimposed on us by enemies or friends. Is this Christian nationalism? Is like this butterfly meme. I mean, I don't know. That sounds pretty hardcore, right. And yet you're hearing the voice of a saint and a martyr there.
Right.
So I think Kingsnorth should spend a little more time kind of wrestling with some of that.
I think the subject of politics just makes people uncomfortable because it makes you uncomfortable. When you start talking about politics, but then the question, I think any Christian who understands the nature of creation and its relationship to God, and the fact that there's an ongoing sort of upholding of the natural world that we live in, and that includes what we might call natural institutions like family life and kind of social life, and by necessity, a political order, we need to think about these things Christianly. So we might say, maybe we can't say that one particular order is the only Christian order, but at least we could say Christianity is relevant and it should inform politics in some ways, and hopefully enrich it.
Yeah, and it can lead to great goods. Like the cathedrals were
Right.
this great and glorious good thing that came out of Christian civilization. So that there needs to be a space to honor that, to recognize that, to say, that's worth holding on to. That's valuable. When Notre Dame burned down, we
Right.
didn't all just stand around and go, it's just another building.
Right.
Who cares? No big
Right.
deal.
Yeah.
The church isn't the building, right? Like
Well,
obnoxious.
that would be your typical Anabaptist response.
Yeah, well, see, this is why I'm not an Anabaptist, right? I'm an Anglican. Yeah, exactly. And so, now I don't think Kingsnorth would be that stupid, but that would be a sort of a reductio of where he's going, so to speak. That you don't shed any particular tears when Notre Dame burns down.
Yeah, I think one of the things that struck me is that his understanding of the ethical implications of the gospel is very much personal.
Right.
So he's looking at Jesus's ethical commands, non-retaliation, give to those who ask, don't expect anything in return, and so on. All of those kinds of things. But he doesn't think through, okay, what are the implications of love your neighbor in a larger social context?
Yeah.
How do I love my neighbor if I give away everything that I have? Is that actually loving my neighbor? Wouldn't it be more loving of my neighbor if, for example, I build a business that employs a lot of people and gives them a way of making a living?
Right, and I disliked this bit where this launching into Jesus didn't say X, Y, and Z, and he goes, well, Jesus didn't tell us to generate wealth so that economic growth could bring about global development. And first of all, any argument that begins with Jesus never said is kind of weak. Jesus had a context. He said some things, it didn't say other things. But yeah, I think that this should be explored and interrogated, because he just seems, it is fundamental allergy to wealth, to riches, the creation of wealth, the accumulation of wealth. But my inner Milton Friedman would like a word. And it's exactly the point you're making here, Glenn. And I also speak as somebody who's served as something of a liaison between the global church and well-off Christians in the West who have a heart for the global church. And I can just tell you right now that I have seen God doing a work in India, in Africa, things that would not have been possible without the generosity of rich white American Christians. I'm just, to be crude about it. And I have been the person to go and say, here's this ministry doing really cool stuff. They want to do more cool stuff. Would you consider blah, blah, blah? And I've written the letters. And that's how that sort of thing works, because money doesn't grow on trees. I'm sorry, again, Milton Friedman, but it's just like, and I think that is a good thing, and God blesses that. And I also dislike Kingsnorth's misquotes. He says, Jesus repeatedly said that it was impossible for a rich man to get into heaven. No, he didn't. he said it was difficult. And that may be true, but he did not say that it was impossible. And there is a place for the rich man in this world.
So are you familiar with Jerry Boyer and the book?
I know the name, yeah.
So Jerry wrote a book called Makers and Takers, and Jerry's got a background in economics. He's actually kind of a talking head on television, so but he's also a Christian. So he's been on like CNBC and stuff like that. Anyway, his point, which I think was a valid one to consider, is you need to locate where Jesus says things, on a map. Right. So when he's in Jerusalem and he's criticizing the wealthy, he's talking to people who are taking advantage of the temple sort of sacrificial system and sort of the money changing is going on and so forth. when he's in some place like Galilee, where it's basically middle class entrepreneurial types, there's not much, there's nothing there. In other words, these things are not talked about. So he's getting at the difference between, say, an entrepreneur who creates wealth and maybe somebody who's politically connected and captures wealth, what we call rent seekers, right?
Well,
so that's an important distinction. But I think, related to this, getting back to, the question, how do you love your neighbor? Let's say I'm a judge, right? And a woman is robbed. Do I quote Jesus from the Sermon on the Mount saying, don't resist an evil person? If somebody asks for something, you give them, your cloak as well. Is that where I go? Or do I go to, say, standards that are, developed from what's implicit in, not stealing, you should not steal and you should not covet, that a person has a right to certain things. And one of those things is property. And the job of the magistrate in a situation like that is to protect that woman and to punish the wicked. And that's not considered in this talk at all.
The Apostle Paul, the magistrate does not bear the sword in vain.
Right.
It's right there.
He also said if you don't work, you shouldn't eat.
Yeah.
Right. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah. And similarly, I mean, you think of local ministries. I mean, on the one hand, everyone in the church, whatever their socioeconomic level, has gifts to give, and they give of what they have, and out of their many or lack. But without those that have substantive amounts to give, churches fold very quickly, and there's no helping the poor when they do. And this isn't just generated out of thin air.
Thank you, Milton Friedman.
You can take it a step further and say, Paul has he's got a Substack. How do people read the Substack? Well, they go on their computers. Where do the computers come from?
Right. Well, and he does acknowledge this. He frequently says, and I know that I'm living in civilization, right? I mean, like I'm giving this lecture, and here I am. I'm not abiding by this, but that bugs me, And he's like, he wants it to bug you too.
Well, and he did say he's wrestling with this. He doesn't really know how to resolve the issues in his own life. I mean, he does acknowledge that particularly in the Q&A, I think maybe at the end of the lecture as well. He talks about, he basically says, I can't live with the implications of what I'm saying, or at least I'm not living with them, and I really don't know how to fix that.
Well, and again, I think maybe the thing is that we're focusing too narrowly on a particular set of biblical references and ideals. When we think about the history of the Christian faith, it's a very broad thing and includes all sorts of people. Not only Anthony of the Desert, but it includes Constantine. So unless you're just the sort of person that maybe just wants to
unless
say,
you're Stanley Hauerwas.
Yeah, Constantine wasn't a Christian, but
the chat.
But that's the thing to consider. Okay, we're in a world where it's a fallen world that we're living in, which means that if you're going to be involved with the messy work of actually trying to do anything, you're going to have a lot of stuff that you're dealing with that you wish you didn't have to deal with it, and maybe even a number of things that are sort of unintended consequences that follow your best efforts.
Yeah.
That's just the reality of the situation.
Now, where I will go with this, and I mean, this is my attempt to try and sort of meet Kingsnorth halfway. So I voted third party this past election. I wrote a whole little essay on my own Substack about why that was. And I got some pushback for that, including some pushback from guys like Father Calvin Robinson.
Sure.
And Father Calvin is very much the kind of figure who Paul kind of has in his sights with this lecture, I think. And I do think that there does have to come a point at which Christians are willing to, and I'm going to slip it to evangelical mode, but kind of let go and let God. And I mean, I've seen people kind of tweeting about like who's going to be welcome in the halls of power with this administration and who's not. And And all you sort of like school marmish, squishy evangelicals, you're not going to be welcome in the halls of power anymore. Now, I dislike squishy, school marmish, big Eva as much as anybody else. But I'm also not necessarily sure that Christians should be super concerned about whether they're welcome in the halls of power or not. I tend to think it's like, if you are, cool. But if you're not, oh well, it's not like we're going to suddenly wake up tomorrow morning and have no idea what we're doing. There's still plenty of stuff for the church to go about doing. And I don't think that voting, to give a concrete example here, I don't think that voting in the presidential election, say, or voting in any election, is a duty. So that like you're forfeiting your position in civilization if you don't do it. And I saw people kind of making that argument that this is the dirty business of being a citizen. Yeah, it can be a little messy sometimes, but you got to do it. It's like changing a diaper or something. I heard someone make that analogy. And I just disagree with that. And that is where I think we were reminded, oh, that's right, this world isn't our home. Oh, that's right, we are strangers and sojourners. And at a certain point, you have to kind of let things go down to hell in the handbasket. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I would even take it to something, that maybe a business owner has to deal with on a daily basis when he or she actually has employees. Sometimes you need to fire somebody, and that person may have dependents, and those dependents are going to experience some of the downside of that. But you just have to do it. Maybe the person just isn't the right fit. Maybe the person actually has done something morally wrong and has harmed the business. There are unintended victims when you do anything. So you can't sort of entertain this idea that, okay, my conscience is clear, therefore nothing bad happens because I did the right thing. No, sometimes you do the right thing and things, there are consequences that just accrue because, like I said earlier, we live in a fallen world. There are all sorts of things. This is precisely the Lord's point about not pulling up the tares. There are going to be some consequences that we don't want to have to experience yet, but there will be a day when there's a harvest and it'll all be sorted out. But nevertheless, in the meantime, people will actually have to do some difficult things, like maybe evict somebody from an apartment. I've had to do that, and the people had dependents, children who were just innocent bystanders, but they had to go because I had other obligations. I had obligations to other institutions, my own family, that kind of stuff. So we're not like living in this environment.
Vacuum.
Where the only thing that matters is my intentions or my immediate actions. There are just a lot of things that we're kind of tied into that are affected even when we do, what we really believe that we need to do because we're trying to do the right thing.
I remember Oliver O'Donovan had a book, Bonds of Imperfection. I think that ties in well. I mean, we have all these bonds we're related to that are imperfect in a way, and whether it be political or places in political power or not, there are always ramifications. I think there is a point there, though, Bethel, that where especially this notion that if we just think as Christians that somehow if we get the people that are going to give us a space politically, that's equatable with the kingdom of God, or us now having the sword and everyone else having to submit to being Christian. And I
Right.
think if that psychology is there, and it can be there, I hear it and see it running around. I think that is misplaced. I think, as Augustine taught us a long time ago, there is a perversion in the fallen political power world of the call to have dominion. And that is what goes by libido dominandi, right? This lust for power and this, and so it can be as tempting for a Christian to be drawn into that if it serves, again, a functional purpose of safeguarding what I want to be safeguarded. So we can't lose the heart of the evangel, that we still need to be about conversion, weaning off of our idols and purification of our love so that we can relate to the common goods and the shared goods in a way that isn't about lust and domination, but about, like Chris was saying, having to be just, but sometimes having to be just in a hard way, but nevertheless not doing it in a way that hurts things worse than otherwise, could happen.
Yeah, let me just kind of elaborate a little bit on my own experience. So for about a decade, I was involved in urban ministry in Boston, and my wife and I lived in tough neighborhoods. She was a school teacher in an African Methodist Episcopal school. I was involved in church planting and working with educational efforts amongst immigrants. Our combined income came to about $25,000 in our best year. And even in those days, that was like the poverty level. So I know all about this radical Christianity stuff. But then there was a day that I had a kid. And suddenly, I'm like, well, I need to think about more than the purity of my intentions and my conscience. I need to think about the interest of my household and my child and my wife, and I need to make some money. I need to start doing some stuff that is going to serve the interests of the people that I have some responsibility for. And so, I did that, and I don't regret those years. They were rich and wonderful years, and I have a lot of fond memories from those days. But I just get really impatient with this sort of argument because it strikes me as remarkably either dunderheaded or duplicitous.
I prefer the word naive.
Well, I did notice you subtweeting. This might be a little bit of a good segue, but I saw you kind of subtweeting the part about Jordan Peterson's message to the Christian churches, where Kingsnorth was really going after this idea of masculine Christianity or masculinity in Peterson's advice to young men, which I just thought was very low resolution. I mean, I did think that Peterson's message was sort of endearingly corny and missing the mark in a lot of ways too. But I think Paul was going after it for some of the wrong reasons. And so I used to teach high school, and I had young men in my class who were very smart. They were ambitious. They had ideas of the kinds of things they wanted to go out and do in life. And I think that it would have been a mistake to tell those young guys that wanting to make money was evil in and of itself. That like wanting to go out there and find your garden to tend, find your hero's journey. I think that there's a certain healthiness to those ideas. Now, it's true that yes, Jordan never mentions Jesus once in that message. Okay, we can discuss that. Like, that is an important factor to consider here. But also, you do need something more to hand to young men as far as practical aspirational goals are concerned than a copy of Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, or because it is good to want to start a family. It is good to want to start businesses, to grow, to create, to carve out your place in the world, as long as your loves are rightly ordered. And now I'm going to sound a little bit Catholic, but you need God at the top of your value hierarchy to organize all these other things. And
that's a good Augustinian thing to say, and Reformed people tend to like him.
If I can jump back one moment, I think it's important to Tom was talking about the lust for power, and I think if I'm understanding what he was saying, he sees that as essentially what civilization is.
Yes,
civilization is really built around the lust for power.
Right. So, Steve Bannon's idea of Christian nationalism, which he mentions, and I'm like, I think he does find an appropriate target there, because I don't think Bannon is some kind of really sincere, devout, Christian who just wants to. No, I mean, Bannon has very specific ideas in mind. And I think it's naive for people to place all of this faith in Trump and the Trump administration that somehow they're going to make the West Christendom again or something, which, I mean, not to pick on Father Calvin, but I've seen him saying some of that kind of stuff. And I'm just thinking, I I don't think that's where this train is going. It's not wrong direction.
Well, yeah, but where I think Kingsnorth kind of goes wrong is he's picked a correct target there. That is a genuine problem. But in trying to critique the problem, he goes to this very naive reading of Jesus's ethics and uses it in a way that is really, I think, unhelpful, even in addressing the problem that he's identified.
Right.
So he starts in what I think is a good spot, but then in trying to figure out what to do with the problem, he goes to the wrong spot. He goes to the wrong place to address it.
Yeah, and I mean, if you want to talk about like greed or envy, the deadly sin of envy, I mean, there's a reason why Peterson goes on and on about the bloody Marxists. And envy is really, it's at the root of Marxism. If you want to go there, it's
Sure.
the two, this old Russian folktale about these two poor peasants, Boris and Ivan, and one day Boris finds a magic lamp and the genie says, "Hey, what's your wish? You want me to give you a goat?" And Boris is like, "No, I want Ivan's goat to die." Right? So that's there you go, and it leads to all of the woke excesses that we've seen, which again I think Kingsnorth does recognize because I've heard him talk about that elsewhere. So I think he needs to see the whole picture and kind of like bring all of these things together. It's not like Marxism is this attractive, cool alternative. It just leads to the same bad places.
So when I think about, say, the Desert Fathers, I don't think of Marxism. I don't even think of a social sort of philosophy. I think of a bunch of really weird dudes who
Right.
went out into the wilderness and were looking for their best life now. And I don't mean that facetiously. I mean, I really think that they were after something. They weren't just saying no to something. They wanted something, and they were willing to pay the price to get it. And I get that. I mean, I love quirky artists. I mean, right behind me over my shoulder is a Finster Angel. I mean, Howard Finster is one of the, great American folk artists. That's an original, by the way. And over this shoulder, this is something by Jack Bumpgardner. Jack is about as close as you get to a farmer trying to be Anthony in the desert. He's a quirky guy, and I love Jack, and I collect his art, and. So I get that, and I get that with with Kingsnorth too. He strikes me as kind of in that vein. But the thing that's different about, say, Anthony of the Desert or Howard Finster or Jack Bumpgardner is they're not trying to present themselves as like the only way to be a Christian, or the that the kind of weird stuff that they're known for is something that everybody should be known for, that kind of thing. Yeah. I think that there's a breadth to Christian civilization. I use the word civilization or Christendom that has room for the Daniel, sort of guy who is in the hierarchy, of some vast empire, and some dude is living in the desert. That's that range, and it's fun. When you Anthony, he didn't try to change the world, but he did. Almost was embarrassed that he did.
Well, I think in a way, Kingsnorth does tap into that because remember he does say something of the notion when it's these figures that actually produce the genuine article, and I think there is something they taste the pearl of great price in their own different pursuits, and by pursuing that above all things, seeking first the kingdom, the byproduct are all the things we seek to attain by seeking it through worldly means of power. And if that's if all he's talking about, I think we've done enough on this show to say we do agree with that. I think where it differs is that it has to become an either or. I think it is a rightly ordered, but I don't think it's an either or that, there may be times at which it has to become an either or. That's fair.
Right. And I mean, I think that there are many, sorts of quiet ways that Christians can take up their cross. that don't involve, sort of a radical heading for the desert or whatever. There are ways that Paul can do that as a family man and a writer, somebody who can't afford the luxury of escaping to the desert.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't think that has to bother him. I don't think I think he can be sort of free of worrying that, maybe he's doing this Christian thing all wrong. It's like, I just want to say, Paul, it's okay. There's 1,000 ways that you can die to yourself by
Yeah.
loving your wife and loving your kids and doing the work that God has given you. And I mean, what I would say to, if I picture like a really zealous young guy who's, like all on fire and like, gee, maybe I need to, just go barefoot and sell everything or whatever, because I'm like, maybe I'm not suffering enough for Christ. I would want to say, and I mean, this is going to sound very Jordan Petersonian of me, but I would want to say, look, kiddo, life is suffering, like, don't worry, it'll happen. You're going to suffer in all kinds of ways. And the rich suffer too, by the way. Everyone does.
Life is pain, princess. Anyone who tells you otherwise is telling you something.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, exactly. Thank you, William Goldman.
Well, maybe this is a good way to get back into these comments on Peterson. So I'm not like a big Peterson guy. I mean, I don't listen to him. I bought a book of his and didn't get past the first chapter, so I'm not like
Which
a
book?
big.
Was it the first one or the?
I can't even remember.
He has a new one now, and I just committed to reviewing his newest one, and I start to look at it, I'm like, what have I done? But anyway.
Actually, before we get to Peterson, I'd like to point out something from Martin Luther, who Paul Kingsnorth might not appreciate because, well, Protestant. But
Western, bad.
Yeah, Western, yeah. But Luther said that being a husband and a father does more, after having been a monk.
That's right.
Does more to sanctify you than being a monk, changing diapers. But learning to be a husband, you learn more about sacrificial love. I mean, this isn't his words, but you learn more about sacrificial love and service. This does more to sanctify you than anything you can do in a monastery.
Those are great points. Getting back to this idea that Peterson is not. The implication was, in terms of Peterson's critique of the church is not legitimate because, one, Peterson's not a Christian, and two, Peterson doesn't quote Jesus or whatever. My thought is that, well, I do think that people can be disappointed with the performance of an institution without being a part of that institution because they value some of the things that it helps to promote. So, for example, like I think of the world of the arts, and when those who are charged with celebrating and preserving the great works of our civilization, instead celebrate somebody duct taping a banana to a wall. I think you have betrayed, what you've been entrusted to do, and I think that's one of the things that I take from Peterson, and that is there are young men out there that you are failing. And here are some things I'm observing in terms of how you're failing. Now, I take that to heart. I was like, yeah, I mean, I don't confuse Peterson with a Christian. He's Jungian, and I've got certain sympathies with Jungian psychology, but I wouldn't describe myself as Jungian. But that I know where he's coming from. And so he's seeing some things because he's coming from a certain place, and he cares about these guys. And for a lot of these guys, one of the reasons why they like Peterson is because they can sense he cares about them and is addressing their questions and their needs and stuff like that, and nobody else is.
Right. Well, I think when Peterson says, your churches, for God's sake, quit fighting for social justice, attend to some souls, and then Paul gets all prickly because Peterson is stunking on social justice. Or saving the planet, which, because Kingsnorth is still kind of that old environmentalist hippie at heart, he's also going to be sensitive when people dismiss environmentalist stuff. But, I mean, look at, Paul comes from England, okay? So let's just think about the Church of England. for a moment, to sort of, we're going to pick on a specific church, failing church. Like, who listens to the Church of England these days, right? Like Justin Welby just resigned and everybody clapped. I mean, it's like, it was a long time coming. Like, it's a spent force. They're completely impotent. And some of my favorite stuff from Paul Kingsnorth was during the pandemic. And I mean, he wrote great stuff about, like, people need to gather, people need to ignore the nanny state. Well, the Church of England was in lockstep with the English nanny state, and all this safetyism and, wash your hands and blah, blah, blah. Paul hates that kind of stuff. And so that's where, I mean, I think really, Paul and Jordan, if they could just sort of meet each other, they would find they actually agree on some of this stuff. But it's getting kind of lost in translation.
Yeah, I kind of just wish that Paul would become truly funky and not care about
not funky enough, you don't think?
Well, when I think about funky, so I mentioned the Reverend Howard Finster. So the Reverend Howard Finster was a big deal in the 1980s. You can see his work in the Smithsonian and in the Modern Museum of Art in New York City and stuff like that. But he was just a Baptist preacher from rural Georgia, and he just had this vision of producing art that he literally, it's a really a fun story. He one day he was working on a bicycle and he was spread some paint on the bicycle using his finger, and then he looked at his finger and there was the face of Jesus. And Jesus said to him, "Make sacred art." And he said, "How much?" And he said, 5,000 pieces. And so he decided he was going to do that. So that's what I mean by funky. And he ended up becoming like a world celebrated artist. And his, he did album covers for the Talking Heads, and he knew the B-52s. They would go to his Paradise Garden to kind of like get spiritual advice. But he was just a fundamentalist Baptist preacher in the South who was just quirky as all get out.
It's not so far from St. Augustine, who's struggling over all these intellectual questions, and here's girls singing "Open the Book."
Yeah, right. But I guess that's the thing. When I think about Kingsnorth, I think maybe your calling is just to write books and kind of be a weird dude, kind of living in Ireland on the coast and, trying to grow organic, vegetables, that's great. Now, of course, he was invited to give this lecture. It's not like he went, looking for an opportunity to do it. And so he was invited and graciously responded. But I like him just as a just kind of a quirky, fun kind of guy, and he's had some interesting experiences. And, but I can take what he says with a grain of salt. So I don't dislike him or anything. I just disagree with him on a number of these things.
Yeah. The question I have, I'm just curious. Do you know which particular patriarchate he's under in the Orthodox Church?
I know.
Because it seems to me that aside from I'm not that familiar with the Orthodox world, but it seems to me that aside from the Moscow Patriarchate, a lot of the Orthodox world doesn't seem to be that interested in cultural or political issues at all. They kind of, my impression, and this is purely an impression, I may be totally off here, but their cultural engagement is not something that they seem to be big on overall.
I think it does depend.
Except for Moscow.
Yeah.
You do have the Ortho Bros on Twitter. Yeah. They are a sort of a subculture unto themselves, and so in a way that there's this sort of, you might be able to kind of group them with the rad trads in some ways, although they hate each other, but they have some of the same aesthetic maybe.
Yeah, I guess when I think about what was I reading here recently? Basically, it was a treatment of Orthodox missionary work and how from the very early days of that work, there was a real emphasis on sort of national, I guess, churches. Basically, the idea being that peoples are converted, and so there's a sense in which, God creates peoples. We're told that in the at Mars Hill, at the Areopagus, Paul talks about God appointing places for peoples to live and for the various families of the earth. And so the idea is that there should be these churches that should be really wrapped up in these national identities. So you think about the Russian Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church. I'm not a. It seems to me like in my own personal experience, because I've got a number of Orthodox friends that they all seem to be, what is it, the Syrian.
Antiochian.
Yeah, that seems to be where a lot of the evangelicals end up. A lot of the converts.
Yeah, that's bigger in the United States. It's where a lot of evangelicals land.
Yeah.
The Orthodox were really big on vernacular liturgies early on.
Right.
So.
Yeah, that ties into this, right?
Well, and there is. I mean, I was at school in Oxford. I was living at St. Gregory's with the Orthodox community, and the one who is now Alfiev Ilarion, who is, I think, the Metropolitan of Russia, or he's definitely one of the big representatives, and Matthew Steenberger, who is now Bishop Irene of I think London or in the U.S. But they did tend to have a very strong critical, spiritual, moral criticism of Western spirituality. And I think there was, something of a critique of Western Christianity in that. And so you may be getting a hint of that in Kingsnorth, that the way in which that relationship sits isn't one that values enough the kind of hypertrophied spirituality that Eastern Christianity has, that is very world denying and very, oriented towards theosis in a much, much deeper way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Related to this idea of having a sort of a cultural kind of expression, there's a kind of a paradox here in the sense that when we think about the Orthodox, there is this mystical kind of component to the Orthodox worship and spirituality. And at the same time, they can be very particular about the artifacts. Obviously, when you think about like icons, in other words, it's not a kind of world denying like you see, say, for example, in certain Protestant groups that say, it doesn't matter where we worship, we can worship in a barn or whatever, and that, with the Orthodox, you need to have a church and it needs to be shaped like this, and it needs to have this on the dome, and
aesthetic,
you need to have all these icons all over the place, and you need to have the vestments and just so, and the long beard and the big black hat. It's not a church if you don't have those things, so they can get really particular about that kind of stuff, which is kind of an interesting thing to sort of ponder and reflect on. I don't have much to say about it. It's just something I came to my mind just now. Anyway, we're getting to the point where we could probably wrap things up a bit. Is there anything, Bethel, that you wanted to get into that we haven't so far?
So just one sort of positive note that I was briefly going to touch on is that I think, not exactly positive about the lecture, but I don't think he was quite fair to Ayaan Hirsi Ali.
Right.
Because he brings her in as her original unheard essay, which to be fair, I do think she kind of buried the lead in that essay, because it was crafted very much along these the sort of civilizational Christianity kind of lines. But since then she's made it clear that she had a personal crisis, and that it was a very a sort of old-fashioned encounter with Christ kind of things, not just about Christianity as a bulwark against other bad stuff.
Right.
So I think Hirsi Ali is a nice exception to some of these sort of utilitrats. I saw somebody calling them, people like Peterson, or maybe we can name Douglas Murray,
sure,
who primarily think about Christianity in those kinds of terms. She's actually been willing to completely embrace it as her own personal faith. So I really look forward to seeing how she grows and develops there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and she brings a really valuable, set of experiences to us to learn from, coming out of the world that she's come out of, not just, the immediate background with kind of the new atheists and all that kind of stuff, but further back with Islam and everything.
Brotherhood, yeah.
So she's got a range of experiences that are worth learning from. And so that's great. Anyway, well, this has been a fun topic, and just so folks know, I actually subscribe to Paul's King Substack, so I don't read all of the stuff. I mean, there are only so many descriptions of holy wells in Ireland that I can read about. But he does have a lot of things that are worth hearing. I mean, his criticisms, particularly related to AI, are very compelling. Yeah. His criticism of the machine, what he's referring to as kind of this instrumentalist, utilitarian way of thinking about reality in the world and our place in it, is really good. So there are a lot of things about his work that I can support. He just kind of irritated me for the reasons I already talked about. Particularly when I think about, like I noted my ancestor. It's not as though there weren't people who were harmed by the Native Americans. I mean, the town in Connecticut that my other house is in is Tallinn, Connecticut, and it has a list of the war dead going all the way back to the French and Indian Wars, men who died from that town in those wars, and the longest list is the French and Indian War. I mean, so there was, we're talking about, there's a reason why in our founding documents they were referred to as savages. It was because many people have been savagely killed by them. Now, does that? I'm not saying that there wasn't atrocities the other way. I'm just saying that we can be blind to, the big picture because we decide that there's one part of the story that is worth knowing and the other part doesn't have any significance, and we don't need to know it. Anyway. Well, thanks a lot, Bethel. This has been great to have you, and we're pleased to have you on the show, not just for this, but also because of your contribution to the book, Life on the Sign-Up Planet. I'm looking forward to receiving my copy. I've seen, of course, the PDF version, but I'm actually looking forward to the physical copy. Anyway.
Sweet. Well, maybe we can do this again sometime. That'd be fun.
Perfect. Oh, that'd be great. Well, all right. Well, thanks a lot for listening to the Theology Pugcast. You've made it all the way to the end of this episode, and we're really pleased that you've taken the time to listen to this conversation. And if you like what we do, there's a way to support it. We don't make any money. We just raise money to pay the bills. So if you'd like to help us pay the bills to keep the show going, that's appreciated. And you can learn how to do that through our Patreon page, and there's a link in the show notes to that. All right. Thanks a lot, and bye-bye.
The Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. To learn more about the church, you can visit trinityreformedkirk.com. trinityreformedkirk.com.